chat.
Or they can also directly unmute themselves if they want to ask questions.
Yeah, yeah. I see Teresa Liporace from Aidha.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation for IDEC take part in this very important discussion. Thank you, Nora and Professor Octaviano, to bring a lot of so important issues to clarify and contribute to our discussion, even in our country. I'd like to ask you another point, adding those who are proposed from you in the all the challenges the developing and countries are facing now, a lot as lack of fiscal service, fiscal space, and the impact from those countries where the coronavirus has spread, the impact on tourism and another. I would like to add an important issue is the lack of transparency. In Brazil, I think this also happens in Indonesia. Um, we have now we know exactly that we will face this challenge regarding the lack of transparency because we really are not able to follow all the impacts that the crisis will bring to us, and of course the consumers that will pay the bill in the end of the day. They will also pay the bill of the inefficiency and the structural problem that we are facing in all sectors in Brazil. And those powerful companies and sectors that are very well organized are lobbying in the Congress and at the executive, asking for measures to help their sectors, and the consumers who are less organized are not able to follow the real impact of the crisis. I know it will be big, of course, but we know that in the end of the day, we'll have to pay also for impacts that are not caused by the crisis. So I'd like to ask you about this issue in the other country, because lack of transparency, it's very, I think, will contribute a lot for impact the poor people in our countries. And also another point I'd like to bring is we are in I think that the principles of market economy should be taken in account, because for example it's important also to allocation of the risks for those companies, for the financial sector institutes. They do not want to lose money in this process. So how can we ask for this bring in the scene of the discussion how is important to have to take in account the principle of a market economy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Teresa. I see another questions here in the chat room from Helen Welby. The question is, what gender-focused policy responses should regulators and central banks be undertaking in the short term and medium term? I will allow another one audience to ask this question. Or for those who don't have any questions, probably you can just give us some overview about the presentations or comments, probably share. Okay, I think we can just go on with these two questions. The first question from Teresa is that lack of transparency gives huge impact to the people, and the allocation of the resources for financial sectors. How to take this into account? And the second question is, as I already mentioned before, what gender-focused policy response should regulators and central banks be undertaking in the short term and medium term? I think we can start from
All right. Very good questions and points. Teresa, Teresa is on the spot. The quality of governance, institutional governance, is at the core. There is always the risk of capture of whatever comes from the public sector as a catastrophe insurer. Well, the agents may opportunistically, definitely some of them, many of them, will try to grab a part of a share of the transfers, even if they wouldn't be entitled as, let's say, much vulnerable small and medium enterprise, or as a poor person needing income transfers. And in this regard, as she aptly highlighted, transparency is at the core, because only with transparency we have the light of the sun over these shadowy moves by interest groups. And it doesn't help that we have had a president in the country that has objected to the policies against the infection, the policies regarding the pandemic curve. Fortunately, to some extent, checks and balances work in my own country, Brazil, in the sense that the governors and Congress and the Supreme Court have kind of done a joint effort to establish some containment policies. Otherwise, it would be a disaster, even deeper than the figures that Gustavo is presenting. So Teresa is right, is on the spot. More than ever, we need transparency, we need accountability, so as to make sure that the package, which will have an impact on the public debt that's taken for granted everywhere in the world, that they mean support to those who really need it. I will leave the gender policy response to Nurul.
Okay, so basically regarding the gender-focused policy response, the question is, should the regulator and control be understanding in the short and medium term? I think when it comes to regulation, I think the government has a regulation on this. They have the plan. In terms of Indonesia, we have the plan on this, but not being implemented well. But the most important thing is how to implement this policy. That's what we need to think about, because in case of Indonesia, maybe, and I think the world also, the implementation should involve not only the government or public sector, but also involve like CSO, academicians, and other parties when it comes to gender-focused policy, because the government shouldn't see this from their own lens, but from their own perspective, but to see it from other perspectives, especially CSO. I think that will work in terms of constructing a good, effective policy.
I would like to complement also. Well, from Teresa's side, I think Octaviano has answered what she wanted to. And about Ellen's question, I would like to point out that here in Brazil, this gender perspective is very essential, because women are most of the householders. Mainly on the lower classes, single mothers are usually the ones who hold the houses, literally, the ones who provide the money for the family. So this is a very bold social issue, and as Octaviano has told, we have income transfer policy in which women are the ones receiving the money. So they already play a very important role in Brazilian family. So what would be the responses, the policy responses from regulators and central bank to these women? On the short term, the main thing would be providing them with more money, since they are the ones feeding the child and the ones leading the houses. And this is partially done since they are entitled to twice the amount that the government is providing to other people. So this is partially done. But still on the short term, there is a need of providing them loans with lower interest rates, since interest rates in here are really, really high. This will provide them with alternatives of entrepreneurship on the medium and long term that would provide women empowerment as well as economic recovery. And so for the medium and long term, these measures taken right now as reduction of interest rates for this public would have very positive benefits in the long term.
May I add a short story, a short comment on what aptly Gustavo said? You guys know why the conditional cash transfer in Brazil goes to the women. The reason is that in the 90s, a survey was done with families in Brazil, and this survey was replicated and confirmed in other parts of the world, that in the households where the woman had a strong say on the resource allocation, both the weight and the height of the babies were larger, higher than in the house where the male was the sole commander. The women are better when it comes to the health and education of the kids. So this position must be ring-fenced, must be reinforced. And it applies to the case of companies as well. Gender diversity and matters as a factor of economic growth, and so any package, any aspect of public policy should take this into account. If I make something as well on a question asked by Suraji, which I know where it comes from. Suraji asks, what kinds of income generating program governments can create instead of restructuring debt and unemployment? I see what Suraji says, but let's keep in mind the following. Sometimes, and this is very frequent sometimes in Asia, Asian countries do not like very much programs like the cash transfers. In many countries, the culture runs against it. But I can tell you that it is more efficient, it is superior to simply doing public sector work programs, generating ad hoc jobs, in the sense that the countries are obliged to use this kind of direct support, creating very often unnecessary public jobs, because when they don't have the condition to implement the policies like the conditional cash transfers and so on. But frankly, in a case particularly as we are, nothing can beat handing over directly money, income to those who need it. Particularly because the containment policies are designed not to allow the economy to grow. It's not a matter of growing now, because by definition, the economy is locked down. But we have to guarantee the survival of those people who don't have savings, who don't have assets to live from while the economy is stuck. And by the way, something that I deem as quite important, and it's quite important in the policy debate in Brazil, for instance. There is no such a thing. There is no such a thing as a trade-off between the economy and containing the virus. As sometimes people try to say. And let me explain why I can affirm this. Two Federal Reserve Bank economists got together with a professor of the MIT to produce a research on the data about counties and municipalities in the US along the 1918 flu pandemic, which is the historical experiment closest to what we're living through now, respiratory problems and so on. Guess what? And those researchers, they found with data, this is data-based, that the US municipalities which implemented social distancing policies had not only a lower rate of morbidity as compared to those municipalities that did nothing. They had not only lower rates of morbidity, as one would expect, but also their performance after the pandemic was better than the other ones. So there is no trade-off. There is no this, okay, I opt to do nothing in order to save the economy. What the history experience shows clearly that there's no such a trade-off, because with the sickness and rampant contamination, there are also side effects that end up harming the economy. So it's quite important to keep this. It's uncomfortable, it's painful to have forced social distancing policies. Yes, it is, but the alternative is worse. And we have to have income transfers to help navigate the period.
Yeah, thank you very much, Octav. There is another question from Suraji. Suraji, maybe you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly to the panelists.